The merciless August sun hung like molten copper above the endless Kansas plains, its rays beating down on the struggling wagon train that snaked across the buffalo grass. Martha James gripped the weathered sides of the last wagon, her 57-year-old bones protesting every jolt as the wheels lurched over another rut. The faded blue cotton of her dress clung to her skin, soaked with perspiration and prairie dust that had become her constant companion over 4 months of westward travel. "Mom, something ain't right about them missing folks," whispered Rebecca Coleman, the woman sitting across from Martha. Her voice was barely audible over the creaking wheels and lowing cattle. "Eleanor Morris, the Hendricks family, old Pete Sullivan, Hutchins, says they all got sick or died, but we never saw no graves." Martha's heart tightened at the mention of Eleanor, her dearest friend, who had supposedly been left at a mission settlement 2 weeks prior due to consumption. The explanation had never sat well with her, but questioning the wagon master's decisions was a luxury none of them could afford in this hostile wilderness. "Hush now, Rebecca," Martha murmured, though her own suspicions had been growing. "We need to trust Mrs. James." Jeremiah Hutchins's Kentucky drawl cut through their conversation like a blade. The wagon master's cold gray eyes fixed on Martha with the calculating look of a merchant appraising damaged goods. Behind him stood his lieutenant's hard men, with sun-weathered faces and hands that never strayed far from their weapons. Martha's stomach dropped as she saw the gathering crowd of settlers' people she'd shared meals and prayers with for months. Now they avoided her gaze, shame and resignation written across their sunburned features like words on a tombstone. "The oxen are failing." Hutchins continued his voice, carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "We're 3 days behind schedule, burning through supplies faster than expected, and winter waits for no one." He paused, letting the implications settle like dust on a grave. "You're slowing us down, ma'am. Can't spare the resources for those who can't pull their weight. Now wait just a minute." Rebecca started to protest, but her husband's hand on her arm silenced her. "Please, Mr. Hutchins." Martha's voice cracked despite her efforts to remain dignified. "I can walk. I won't be a burden. I have some money saved. Decisions made." Hutchins nodded to his men, his expression as cold as a January morning. "Help her down. Give her what she can carry." Rough hands seized Martha's arms, dragging her from the wagon despite her protests. Her few possessions scattered into the dirt, a worn leather Bible that had belonged to her late husband Thomas, a precious daguerreotype of their Missouri farm, and the simple gold wedding band she still wore after 2 years of widowhood. "You can't just leave me here to die." Martha scrambled to her feet, chasing after the departing wagons on unsteady legs. "I'm a Christian woman. I have rights." But the wagon wheels rolled relentlessly onward, raising clouds of dust that settled over Martha like a burial shroud. She collapsed to her knees in the buffalo grass, watching until the train became a distant line of dots on the endless horizon. The silence that followed was deafening. No human voices, no creaking wheels, just the whisper of wind through endless grass and the distant cry of a red-tailed hawk circling high above. 3/4 of a mile away, hidden in a shallow depression between 2 rolling hills, Wicasa watched the abandonment unfold with growing unease. At 34, the Lakota warrior possessed the lean, powerful build of a man in his prime. His long black hair adorned with 2 eagle feathers earned in battles against the Crow. Sacred red and yellow war paint decorated his bronze face in patterns that spoke of his victories and vision quests. He had been tracking this particular wagon train for 5 days, part of a scouting party monitoring white settler movements through their people's traditional hunting grounds. His orders were simple: observe and report back to the tribal council. These wagon trains brought soldiers diseases that decimated entire villages, and the steady destruction of buffalo herds that sustained his people through harsh winters. But watching the elderly white woman being cast out like refuse stirred something deeper than duty in Wicasa's chest. His own grandmother, Winona, had died the previous winter during a brutal cold snap, and her final words echoed in his memory. A warrior's true strength is measured not by who he defeats in battle, but by who he chooses to protect when no one else will. She had been speaking of their tribe's elders, but as Wicasa watched Martha collapse in despair, he saw his grandmother's frail form in the woman's shaking shoulders. The callous abandonment violated everything he'd been taught about honor and the sacred duty to protect those who could not protect themselves. Wicasa guided his painted horse down the gentle slope, moving with the fluid silence that marked him as one of the finest scouts in his band. Martha looked up through her tears to see what her terrified mind interpreted as death approaching on horseback, a painted savage straight from the nightmare stories told around settler campfires. "Stay back," she cried, scrambling backward through the grass with desperate, clumsy movements. "Please, I have nothing of value." But Wicasa dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening, despite the rifle across his back and the knife at his belt. From his horse's saddle, he retrieved a buffalo horn water vessel filled with cool stream water, placing it carefully on the ground between them, before backing away several respectful steps. His English vocabulary consisted of perhaps 30 words learned from occasional encounters with fur traders, but his gesture transcended language barriers. "Drink," he said simply, his voice surprisingly gentle for a man painted for war. Martha stared at him in bewilderment, her preconceptions crumbling like sandcastles before the tide. This supposed savage looked nothing like the bloodthirsty monsters described in newspaper accounts back east. He was simply a man, younger than her own son would have been offering water to someone dying of thirst under the merciless prairie sun. As the day wore on and the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the endless sky in shades of orange and purple that Martha had never seen back in Missouri, her desperate thirst finally overcame her fear. She crawled forward on trembling hands and knees and drank deeply from the horn, the cool water tasting like salvation itself. Wicasa observed her with careful, intelligent eyes, noting the dignity with which she tried to compose herself despite her obvious terror. Her dress, though travel-stained and worn, had been well made. This woman came from a family of some means. The careful way she arranged her skirts and smoothed her graying hair spoke of deeply ingrained habits of propriety that even abandonment couldn't erase. That night, as coyotes called to each other across the moonlit prairie, and Martha shivered despite the warm August air, she began to understand that her captor, if that's what he was, defied every story she'd ever heard about Indians. He built a small fire to keep predators at bay using dried buffalo chips that burned clean and smokeless. When she shivered, he offered her his own blanket while he sat watch through the long hours of darkness. Twice during the night, she woke to see him adding fresh fuel to the flames with the quiet care of a guardian angel. The next morning brought their first real test of the fragile trust growing between them. Martha woke to find soft strips of rawhide around her wrists, not tight enough to cause pain or cut off circulation, but clearly intended as restraints. "What is this?" she demanded, struggling against the bonds with more indignation than fear. Wicasa knelt beside her and carefully untied the leather strips, then pointed to the vast, dangerous landscape surrounding them. He made a sweeping gesture that encompassed threats beyond their immediate sight, wild animals, treacherous terrain, and worse dangers that walked on two legs. "Bad men," he said in his limited English, his voice heavy with genuine concern. "You walk, you die." Before Martha could formulate a response, the sound of approaching horses announced the very danger he'd warned against. 3 riders appeared on a distant ridge, their silhouettes dark against the brightening sky. Even at that distance, the glint of weapons and their predatory posture marked them as the kind of men who made their living preying on the weak and isolated. "Well, well, what have we here?" called the leader As they rode closer, a grizzled man with pale, cold eyes and a voice like grinding millstones. "Looks like we got ourselves a survivor from that wagon train, and she's made herself an Indian friend." The first gunshot cracked across the morning air as Wicasa grabbed Martha's hand and pulled her toward his horse. The bullet whistled past her ear close enough that she felt the heat of its passage and heard its angry buzz. More shots followed as they mounted and spurred the horse into a desperate gallop, weaving between buffalo wallows and prairie dog towns with life-or-death urgency. Martha clung to Wicasa's waist as they raced across the broken terrain, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. Behind them, the outlaws gave chase with the persistence of wolves following a wounded deer. One bullet struck a rock inches from her hand, showering them with razor-sharp fragments that drew blood from her cheek. But Wicasa knew this land in ways the outlaws never could, having grown up ranging across these endless grasslands with hunting parties since boyhood. He guided them through hidden draws and dry creek beds, using the terrain's natural features to break their pursuers' line of sight. Ancient buffalo trails invisible to white eyes became their highway to safety, winding through landscape that looked identical to untrained observers, but held 1,000 subtle variations to someone raised to read its secrets. When the chase finally ended, in a maze of weathered sandstone formations that would have required hours to search thoroughly, Martha found herself pressed against Wicasa's chest in the cool darkness of a shallow cave, feeling his heart beat as rapidly as her own. The outlaws' frustrated shouts echoed off the rock walls as they searched nearby, growing fainter as they moved on to easier prey. "Why?" Martha whispered when she was certain their pursuers had gone. "Why help me?" Wicasa was quiet for a long moment, considering how to bridge the language barrier between them. Finally, he spoke softly in his own tongue, words she couldn't understand, but that somehow conveyed protection on her, and something deeper that made warmth rise in her chest, despite their dangerous circumstances. The days that followed blurred together in a routine of constant movement and growing trust between the unlikely companions. They traveled during the cooler hours of dawn and dusk, resting during the blazing midday heat in whatever shade they could find, usually little more than the shadow cast by a boulder or the sparse cover of a stunted mesquite bush. Martha's feet, soft from years of domestic life in Missouri, developed painful blisters that burst and bled inside her worn leather shoes. Each evening, Wicasa tended to her wounds with a patience that would have surprised those who knew him only as a fierce warrior. From his medicine pouch, he produced a healing paste made from prairie plants his grandmother had taught him to identify as a child, applying it with gentle hands before wrapping her feet in strips torn from his own shirt. Water became their constant preoccupation. The streams marked on emigrant trail maps had long since dried to cracked mud under the relentless summer sun. They survived on what Wicasa could locate in hidden seeps and rock pools, knowledge passed down through generations of his people, who had learned every secret the land held. He showed Martha which cactus pads could be eaten, how to dig for moisture-rich roots with a sharpened stick, and which insects provided crucial protein when other food was scarce. Her blue dress, once neat and proper, became a patchwork of tears and stains that told the story of their journey across hostile terrain. But she wore it like armor against a wilderness that seemed determined to strip away, not just her life, but her dignity and humanity as well. It was on their 6th day together, as they sheltered in a grove of stunted cottonwoods near a dry creek bed, that Martha discovered the horrifying truth about her abandonment. The smell reached them first, the unmistakable stench of death and decay that made Martha gag and cover her nose with her sleeve. Wicasa's face grew grim as he recognized the odor, and he tried to steer her away from its source. But Martha had caught the scent, and her growing suspicions about Jeremiah Hutchins demanded answers, no matter how terrible they might be. "I have to know," she said, pushing past his restraining arm with the determination of a woman who had already lost everything that mattered. The sight that greeted them in a hidden ravine made Martha's blood turn to ice water in her veins. Bodies in various stages of decomposition lay in a shallow mass grave, hastily covered with stones and dirt, elderly men and women, whose clothing marked them as immigrants, their condition suggesting violent rather than natural death. But it was what Martha found clutched in one skeleton's bony fingers that transformed her horror into consuming rage. The silver locket was tarnished black, but unmistakable and oval, engraved with the initials E.M. that Martha had given to Eleanor Morris as they'd embraced goodbye back in Independence, Missouri, what felt like a lifetime ago. "This is Eleanor's," Martha said, her voice shaking as she held the locket up to catch the fading afternoon light. "Jeremiah said she died of consumption at the mission, but she's here. They're all here." The terrible truth struck her like a physical blow as she surveyed the scattered remains and noted what was missing. Personal effects that should have been buried with the dead jewelry coins, anything of value, were conspicuously absent. These people hadn't died of disease or accident. They had been murdered for profit, their bodies dumped like refuse in this hidden grave. "He's been selling them." Martha whispered, the full scope of the betrayal washing over her like a tide of acid. "All of us. The weak ones, the old ones, the ones who slow down the train he sells us to outlaws for supplies or safe passage through their territory." The revelation explained so many troubling details that had nagged at her during their journey. Why their wagon train always seemed to have adequate food when other groups starved. Why certain notorious outlaw bands never attacked them despite controlling the territory they passed through. Why Hutchins always had ready explanations for the disappearance of the vulnerable. And why he discouraged people from asking too many questions about the missing. Wicasa knelt beside her, understanding her anguish, even without following every word. He had seen the aftermath of such betrayals before, white men who spoke of friendship and civilization while planning murder and theft. The sight of these desecrated graves stirred his own memories of villages, burned families, slaughtered promises, broken by men who measured honor in dollars and cents. Martha looked up at him through her tears, her green eyes now blazing with a fury that transformed her from victim to avenger. "I have to stop him," she said, her voice steady despite the rage coursing through her veins. "He's going to keep doing this, keep selling people, keep murdering them for profit. I have to warn the others before he kills anyone else." Wicasa shook his head, genuine concern for her safety overriding all other considerations. Returning to the wagon train meant walking directly into mortal danger, probably to her death. But Martha's determination was absolute, forged in the furnace of betrayal, and tempered by the knowledge that more innocents would die if she remained silent. "Help me," she pleaded, grasping his calloused hands in hers. "Please, I can't let him murder any more people." Looking into her eyes and seeing the courage and righteousness burning there like a sacred flame, Wicasa made his choice. He had come to love this brave woman, not just for her resilience in the face of abandonment, but for her refusal to let evil triumph simply because fighting it was dangerous. He would follow her into the heart of danger itself if that's what honor demanded. Before they set out in pursuit of the wagon train now, 3 days ahead of them on the main trail, Wicasa made a decision that would prove crucial to their survival. Leading Martha to a high promontory that commanded a view of miles of surrounding terrain, he built a signal fire using dried buffalo dung and green prairie grass that would create the specific smoke pattern his people would recognize. "What are you doing?" Martha asked, watching him work with the practiced efficiency of a man who had sent such messages many times before. Wicasa created 3 distinct columns of smoke that rose straight into the still air. 2 brief puffs followed by a long, sustained stream, repeated 3 times in succession. He pointed toward the distant hills where bands of his people ranged in their endless cycle of following the buffalo herds, then gestured to encompass both of them. "A call for help," he explained in his improving English. "My brothers, maybe see, maybe come." "Will they?" Martha asked, hope and fear warring in her voice. He nodded grimly, though uncertainty shadowed his dark eyes. Maybe, if wind good. If they watch sky. The tracking proved easier than Martha had expected. And the wagon train left deep ruts in the prairie sod, scattered debris, and the inevitable signs of a large group moving slowly across the landscape. Broken wagon wheels discarded furniture too heavy to continue hauling, and the occasional grave marked their passage like breadcrumbs leading back to civilization. But following the trail meant crossing open ground where they would be visible to scouts and sentries exposed to the same outlaws who served as Hutchins' partners in his murderous enterprise. They moved carefully, using available cover and staying alert for signs of watchers. On their second day of pursuit, Martha's worst fears were realized. The attack came at dawn as they watered Wicasa's horse at a small spring hidden among a cluster of red rocks. Martha was filling their water vessels when the sound of metal on leather, a gun being drawn from a holster, made her freeze with terror. "Well, well," came a familiar voice that made her blood run cold. Look what crawled out of the grave. Martha turned slowly to see Billy Hutchins, the wagon master's younger brother, whom she now recognized from his occasional visits to their camp. He looked like a younger, more vicious version of Jeremiah, the same cold eyes, the same calculating cruelty, but without the elder brother's thin veneer of civilization. "Billy," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I should have known. Should have stayed dead like a good girl." Billy replied, his pistol trained on her chest. "Would have saved everyone a lot of trouble." 4 more outlaws emerged from concealment among the rocks, their weapons ready, and their faces showing the casual brutality of men who killed for money. Wicasa remained motionless beside his horse, but Martha could see the tension in his shoulders as he calculated distances and angles. "Drop that rifle, Indian," Billy commanded. "Nice and slow, or the lady gets a bullet in her pretty head." Instead of complying, Wicasa dove sideways as his rifle came up the weapon's crack, echoing off the surrounding rocks. His shot took one outlaw center mass, dropping the man with a scream of pain and rage. But the others had spread out, using the terrain to their advantage as they closed in with professional efficiency. Martha threw herself behind the largest boulder as bullets began flying, lead slugs spanking off rock and whining into the morning air. One outlaw tried to rush their position, but found himself facing Wicasa's knife, the blade sliding between his ribs with deadly precision. The fight became a desperate game of cat and mouse among the red rocks, with Martha and Wicasa using every available scrap of cover, while their enemies tried to maneuver for killing shots. Wicasa's rifle cracked with methodical precision, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. A bullet creased Wicasa's shoulder, spinning him around and sending crimson spattering across the stones. Another shot shattered his rifle stock, leaving him with only his knife and tomahawk for close combat. Martha grabbed a fist-sized rock and hurled it at the nearest outlaw, catching him across the temple hard enough to send him stumbling. "Enough of this," Billy snarled, stepping into the open with his pistol raised. "Time to end this little dance." But as he squeezed the trigger, a war arrow sprouted from his chest like a deadly flower, the flint point punching through his heart and dropping him in his tracks. A dozen Lakota warriors materialized from concealment on the surrounding hills, their painted faces fierce in the morning light, and their weapons ready for battle. Wicasa's smoke signal had been seen, after all. The remaining outlaws tried to flee, but found themselves surrounded by men who knew this country, like the lines on their own palms. 2 died with arrows in their backs before they'd gone 50 yards. The last threw down his weapons and begged for mercy, but found none from warriors whose people had suffered too much at the hands of such men. As the echoes of battle faded into silence, Martha found herself cradling Wicasa's head in her lap, while the tribal medicine man examined his wounds. The shoulder wound was painful, but not life-threatening, though the loss of blood had left him weak and dizzy. "You live," the medicine man pronounced in broken English, his weathered hands gentle as they cleaned and bound the injury. "But need rest, much rest. Martha looked down into Wicasa's pain-filled eyes and saw her own love reflected there, deeper and truer than anything she had ever experienced. They had been through fire together, had chosen each other over the safety and familiarity of their separate worlds. Whatever trials lay ahead, they would face them as one. The wagon train was camped in a natural amphitheater when Martha and the Lakota war party finally caught up with it after 3 days of hard traveling. Jeremiah Hutchins had chosen the site for its defensive advantages. Low hills surrounding a central depression with good water and grass for the animals. He had no way of knowing that those same hills would soon hide his enemies. As twilight settled over the prairie and cooking fires began to dot the camp like fallen stars, Martha felt her heart clench at the familiar sounds of her former community. Children crying from hunger and exhaustion, adults arguing in low voices about their dwindling supplies, the lowing of cattle too tired to graze properly. These people had cast her out to die. But they were still human beings, trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Now she was returning to save them from the very man they trusted with their lives. "I go in alone," Martha whispered to Wicasa, who sat his horse with obvious discomfort despite the medicine man's treatment of his wounds. "If something goes wrong, if they capture me, you and your men get away safely." Wicasa shook his head with what strength he had. "Where you go, I go." But Martha was already moving, slipping between the scattered wagons like a ghost in her travel-stained dress. The blue fabric, once neat and proper, now hung on her like burial clothes, making her appear almost supernatural in the flickering firelight. As she approached the center of camp, Martha could hear voices from Hutchins' tent and the wagon master's familiar Kentucky drawl mixed with other tones she didn't immediately recognize. She paused in the shadow of a nearby wagon, straining to make out the conversation within. "That's getting too dangerous, Jeremiah," came a younger voice with the same regional accent. "That Indian and the old woman, if they're still alive, they could cause real problems." "Don't worry yourself, Billy," came Hutchins' reply, and Martha's blood turned to ice as she realized the wagon master was talking to his brother, the same Billy who had tried to murder her at the spring. Somehow, he had survived and made his way here ahead of them. "The Army's paying good money for information about Lakota movements." Hutchins continued. "Colonel Morrison wants detailed maps of their winter camps, their sacred sites, everything. Between that and our other business arrangements, we'll be rich men by spring." Martha's mind reeled as the full scope of Hutchins' treachery became clear. He wasn't just selling vulnerable emigrants to outlaws for profit. He was also serving as a spy for the U.S. Army, gathering intelligence about Lakota territories and tribal movements to facilitate future military campaigns. Through a gap in the tent flap, she could see papers spread across Hutchins' camp table, hand-drawn maps marking the locations of Lakota villages, sacred sites, and seasonal hunting grounds. Letters bearing military seals lay beside them, along with a leather pouch that probably contained payment for services rendered to the Army's westward expansion. "The old woman knows too much," Billy was saying, his voice tight with worry. "If she talks, she won't get the chance," Hutchins interrupted coldly. "Neither will that Indian lover of hers." Martha had heard enough. Taking a deep breath to steady her nerves, she stepped into the tent. "Hello, Jeremiah." Both men froze as if struck by lightning, and their conversation dying mid-syllable as they stared at the apparition before them. Hutchins' weathered face went white, then flushed red, then white again as he struggled to process what he was seeing. Billy's hand moved toward his pistol, but Martha was ready for him. Her hand swept across Hutchins' camp table, knocking over the oil lantern and sending flaming liquid cascading across the scattered maps and documents. Glass shattered, and flames spread with hungry speed, the tent's canvas walls beginning to smolder as Martha dove for cover. Billy's shot went wide in the sudden chaos, the bullet punching through the burning canvas into the night beyond. The sound of gunfire and the sight of spreading flames triggered immediate pandemonium throughout the camp. Fire in the master's tent, someone screamed. Settlers began pouring out of their wagons, some carrying buckets to fight the blaze, others grabbing weapons as they assumed the camp was under attack. Children cried in terror, while their parents tried to make sense of the chaos erupting around them. "Indians!" shouted a man named Morrison, pointing at shapes moving in the darkness beyond the firelight. "We're surrounded." But the confusion was exactly what the watching outlaws had been waiting for. They had been camped in the surrounding hills for hours, ready to collect their next payment of human cargo from Jeremiah Hutchins. When they saw fire and heard shooting, they assumed their arrangement had been discovered and their partner was fighting for his life. Rather than risk exposure or capture, they decided to eliminate all witnesses and take whatever they could carry from the wagons. The first volley of shots came from 3 different directions, muzzle flashes blooming like deadly flowers in the darkness surrounding the camp. Bullets whistled through the air, some finding flesh, others splintering wagon wheels and scattering cooking utensils with metallic clangs. Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who had been Martha's neighbor in the wagon train, fell with a cry of pain as a bullet tore through her shoulder. Samuel Morrison dropped his rifle and clutched his leg, where another shot had shattered bone. Children screamed and scattered like frightened quail, while their parents shouted confused orders that only added to the chaos. Inside the burning tent, Martha and the Hutchins brothers fought a desperate battle amid spreading flames and choking smoke. Jeremiah was larger and stronger than her, but Martha fought with the fury of righteous indignation and 2 months of pent-up rage. She raked her fingernails across his face, drawing parallel lines of blood, while dodging Billy's attempts to get a clear shot without hitting his brother. The tent wall exploded inward as Wicasa burst through the flaming canvas, his wounded arm hanging useless at his side, but his tomahawk gleaming in his good hand. The weapon swept in a deadly arc, its sharp edge biting deep into Billy Hutchins' skull with a sound like an axe hitting wet wood. Billy collapsed without a sound, blood and brain matter spattering across the tent's interior, but his dying finger tightened on his pistol trigger. The bullet caught Wicasa in the thigh, shattering bone and sending the warrior crashing to the ground in agony. Jeremiah screamed in rage at his brother's death, his hands wrapping around Martha's throat with murderous intent. But even wounded Wicasa retained the deadly reflexes of a lifetime warrior. His rifle butt connected with Hutchins' temple, and the wagon master collapsed unconscious across his burning maps and documents. Outside, Wicasa gasped, grabbing Martha's hand and pulling her from the inferno that had consumed the tent. The scene that greeted them was pandemonium. The outlaw gang had descended on the camp like a pack of wolves, their horses weaving between wagons, as riders fired indiscriminately into the panicking settlers. The air filled with gun smoke, screams of pain and terror, and the acrid smell of burning canvas and spilled blood. "Form a circle," bellowed Thomas Coleman, Rebecca's husband, trying to impose some order on the chaos. "Get the wagons together. Make a fort." Some of the settlers responded to his shouted commands, dragging wounded friends and family members toward the hastily formed wagon circle. Others seemed paralyzed by terror, crouching behind whatever cover they could find while bullets flew overhead. Martha saw children separated from their parents, in the confusion elderly people struggling to move fast enough to reach safety, and wounded settlers bleeding in the dirt while the battle raged around them. Something primal awakened in her chest, a protective fury that transformed her from victim to warrior. She grabbed a rifle from a fallen man and took position behind an overturned wagon, firing at the attacking riders with grim determination. Her shots were unpracticed, but earnest, and she had the satisfaction of seeing one outlaw clutch his shoulder and reel in his saddle. Wicasa limped across the battlefield, despite his shattered leg, his rifle cracking with the methodical precision of a man who had never missed what he aimed at. Each shot claimed an outlaw life, but for every enemy that fell, the survivors seemed to grow bolder and more vicious. "We got them on the run," shouted one of the outlaws, spurring his horse toward a group of women and children huddled behind a supply wagon. "Kill them all and take everything." The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes of concentrated violence. Gradually, the outlaws began to gain the upper hand through sheer numbers and superior firepower. The settlers' ammunition was running low, their crude defensive positions were being overrun, and casualties mounted with each passing minute. Martha found herself back-to-back with Wicasa behind their overturned wagon, both of them down to their last few cartridges. A bullet had creased her right arm, leaving a burning furrow that she'd hastily bandaged with strips torn from her dress. Wicasa was pale from blood loss, his movements growing slower and less coordinated as shock began to set in. "Surrender," called the outlaw leader, a scarred man with cold eyes who seemed to be enjoying the slaughter. "Throw down your weapons and we'll make it quick." Some of the settlers were wavering their will to resist crumbling as they saw friends and family members lying motionless in the dirt. Thomas Coleman had taken a bullet in the chest and was coughing up blood, while his wife held him and sobbed. The defense was on the verge of complete collapse. It was then that Martha heard something that made her heart soar with desperate hope. Not the thunder of hoofbeats this time, but the rising chorus of battle songs that her Lakota friends sang as they prepared to meet their enemies. The sound sent chills down her spine and seemed to freeze the outlaws' blood in their veins. 24 painted warriors materialized from the darkness like vengeful spirits, their war paint gleaming in the firelight as they swept into the camp. They moved with the fluid coordination of a wolf pack, each man knowing exactly where his brothers would be without need for spoken communication. Arrows whistled through the night air with deadly accuracy, finding outlaw targets with the precision of men who had learned to hunt before they could walk properly. Lances punched through bodies, tomahawks split skulls, and the few outlaws who tried to flee found themselves cut down before they'd gone a dozen yards. The battle's tide turned in seconds. Outlaws who had been confidently planning murder and robbery suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives against enemies who knew this kind of warfare better than breathing. The night filled with war cries that spoke of generations of warriors defending their people against all enemies. Within minutes, the shooting stopped. Smoke drifted across the battlefield like morning mist, and the surviving settlers stood in stunned silence as they tried to process what had just occurred. Bodies lay scattered among the overturned wagons and smoldering debris. But most of them wore the rough clothing of outlaws rather than the homespun garments of emigrants. As dawn broke over the devastated camp, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, Mda found herself at the center of a gathering crowd. The same people who had watched silently as she was abandoned now approached with shamefaced expressions and desperate pleas for forgiveness. "Martha, we're so sorry." Rebecca Coleman whispered, tears streaming down her soot-stained cheeks. "We didn't know what kind of man Hutchins really was. We trusted him with our lives, and please don't leave us again," added Sarah Morrison, whose husband was still alive but would never walk properly again. "We need someone we can trust to help lead us west. Someone with honor." Martha looked around at the familiar faces, people who had been her companions and community for months of hard travel across hostile country. They weren't evil, she realized, just frightened human beings who had made terrible choices in the name of survival. She could forgive them their weakness, but she could no longer be one of them. From Hutchins' burned tent, she had salvaged some of his papers that hadn't been completely destroyed by the fire, enough to piece together the full scope of his betrayals. Maps marking Lakota sacred sites for military targeting. Letters promising payment for information about tribal movements. A ledger book detailing payments received for surplus emigrants sold to outlaw gangs. The evidence painted a picture of greed and treachery that went far beyond simple abandonment. "I forgive you all," Martha said finally, her words carrying across the gathered crowd like a benediction. "But my home is elsewhere now." She turned to look at Wicasa, who sat propped against a wagon wheel while Yellowbird, the Lakota medicine woman, rewrapped his wounds with fresh herbs and clean bandages. Despite the pain etched across his features and the pallor of blood loss, his dark eyes held warmth and love when they met hers. The Lakota women who had come with the war party were already treating Martha as family, just as they had from the moment she'd chosen to fight beside their men instead of cowering in terror. They shared their food, their medicine, and their protection without reservation, accepting her based on her actions rather than the color of her skin. "You fought for our children," Yellowbird said in the mixture of Lakota English and hand signs that served as common language between peoples learning to bridge cultural divides. "You bled for our warriors. You are sister, now grandmother, to our little ones." As the surviving settlers prepared to continue their journey westward under new leadership, Thomas Coleman's eldest son had assumed command despite his grief. Martha gathered her few remaining possessions. Her husband's Bible, water-stained but readable. The precious daguerreotype of their Missouri farm, cracked but still recognizable. Eleanor's silver locket, which she would keep as a reminder of friendship betrayed and the price of trusting the wrong people. She left behind her torn blue dress, accepting instead the beautifully crafted doe-skin garments that the Lakota women offered her. The soft leather felt strange against her skin after years of cotton and wool. But it represented more than just clothing. It was acceptance into a new family, a new life, a new identity based on choice, rather than accident of birth. Wicasa, supported by two of his tribal brothers, managed to stand as Martha approached. His wounds would heal, the medicine woman had assured them, though he would always carry a limp from his shattered thigh bone. When Martha took his hand in hers, he smiled despite the pain. "You certain?" he asked in English that improved daily through necessity and affection. "Hard life ahead. Different from what you know." Martha smiled back, her green eyes bright with the certainty of a woman who had found her true home at last. "I'm certain. Where you go, I go. Your people are my people now." The Lakota band rode north toward their traditional hunting grounds as the sun climbed higher in the morning sky, carrying with them a white woman who had chosen love over convention, courage over safety, and a new family over the prejudices of the old world. Behind them, the wagon train resumed its westward journey, diminished in numbers, but perhaps wiser for the trials they had endured. Years later, as Martha sat in the lodge that had become her home, teaching Lakota children to read English words from her husband's Bible, while they taught her the ancient stories of their people, she would often think about that moment of choice. The decision to trust love over fear, to embrace the unknown over the familiar, had led to a life richer and more meaningful than anything she could have imagined in her youth. She became a bridge between two worlds, helping to negotiate trade agreements and peace treaties when tensions arose between her adopted people and the steady stream of settlers heading west. Her knowledge of both cultures made her invaluable as a translator and mediator, while her courage in the face of danger earned her respect from warriors and grandmothers alike. The silver locket still hung around her neck, a reminder of friendship betrayed and trust misplaced. But it no longer symbolized only loss. It represented the strength that comes from surviving betrayal, the wisdom earned through suffering, and the courage required to begin again when all seems hopeless. Martha James had been abandoned for being too old, too weak, too burdensome to deserve survival. Instead, she had found a warrior who saw past her age to the strength of her spirit, past her race to the goodness of her heart, and past society's boundaries to the love that makes all things possible. Their story would be told around Lakota fires for generations, a testament to the truth that family is not about blood or tradition, but about the choice to stand together against whatever darkness the world might bring.